the sort of question on everyone's lips is, why on earth are we celebrating the tercentenary of a book of constitutions? If you look at the current book of constitutions, it is what I would describe, and what I suspect many people would describe, as an extremely dull book, a sort of compendium of rules and regulations that would double up as an effective doorstop. The key is that the constitutions that were first published in 1723 were quite unlike that. Constitutions that were first published 3 centuries ago were quite radical. And it's actually quite important to us as Freemasons, and I think to the wider public, to understand how radical they were and what impact they had. And in addition to that, to understand the context, where they came from, and the consequences, what they led to. So this slide really just summarizes that the 1723 constitutions really transformed Freemasonry before the constitutions were published, certainly in the 17th century and in earlier years, but even at the beginning of the 18th century, Freemasonry was at best a relatively unknown organization, varying from the operative lodges in Scotland to, if you like, social gatherings in England. But the 1723 constitutions transformed Freemasonry. It set out Enlightenment philosophical principles, and it really did make a significant break with the old charges that had governed medieval Freemasonry and stonemasons lodges prior to that point. The key changes were the promotion of religious tolerance. Now this cannot be underestimated. You look at Europe at the beginning of the 18th century, indeed you look at Europe from the Reformation onwards, and you see countries riven by religious strife. Literally hundreds of thousands were killed from the 1540s right the way through to the 18th century. Even in the later years of the 17th and early years of the 18th century, you would see in France in particular, but also in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, again, tens of thousands being killed, the war between Protestantism and Catholicism. So religious tolerance was radical. It was radical in the context of a world characterized by religious conflict, and it's radical today for all the reasons we're well aware of. The second idea was that of constitutional government, that Freemasons would be bound by the concept of a supreme legislature, which is a combination of an elected parliament, an independent judiciary, and a constitutional monarch. Again, you take Europe in both the 17th and 18th centuries, you're looking at countries that are dominated by absolutism. Again, it comes back to Catholicism in the main, the idea that the king or queen, but more normally the king, is a divinely appointed monarch, appointed by God, with supreme and absolute authority. Bear in mind that this had been the case pretty much in England until the 1680s. It was only in 1689 that James II was effectively deposed and William and Mary installed. And the first thing, pretty much the first thing they did at their coronation was to swear in Parliament that they would be bound by parliamentary rule. So again, hugely radical, the promotion of constitutional government. This follows really from John Locke, again in the 1670s, 1680s. But to have an organization such as Freemasonry that promotes this as an idea that acts as a vector for its distribution, if you will, is significant. Meritocracy, again, hugely radical at a time when birth and wealth or patronage determined your success. High standards of interpersonal civility, being polite to people regardless of their standing or their status in society. Education and science. So rather than have the church tell you what to think, lay down whether the sun revolves around the earth or vice versa, education and science, rational observation, Newtonianism. And this is important. This is important because science was one of the battlefields of political thought in the 18th century. There was a fight, for want of a better word, between the teachings of Descartes in France and Newton in England. Whether ideas, whether knowledge was innate within the individual or whether it was subject to rational observation, experimentation, testing. And it's quite interesting, actually, that Desaguliers, who was obviously, as you all know, a Grand Master of Grand Lodge, then Deputy Grand Master, one of the most, if not the most influential Masonic figure in the 18th century, he toured Europe, France, Holland, espousing Newtonian theory. This was not just to teach people what Newtonianism was about, it was to emphasize the supremacy, the superiority of Newtonian thought and therefore English science over continental science. And finally, we get down to personal and social self-improvement, again, radical in the context of societies where one's life and standing is preordained. And this, of course, was again part of the general teaching that the king and his lords were at the top of society, the small merchant class, and then the working poor, the peasantry, and everyone born into their status. So these were the ideas that were incorporated in the 1723 Constitution, specified in the charges and in the ritual. And these are values that remain relevant today. And this is really quite important. You know, these are not ideas that are 300 years old and we can cast to history. These are ideas, if you believe in an enlightenment life, these are ideas that are valid today. And when you look actually at all the horrible stuff that's going on, I think, you know, one can look back to the 1723 constitutions, one can look back to the ideas that they promoted, and one should feel proud that one's part of an organization that continues to promote those ideas today. Now, in addition to coming up with a philosophy, if you will, the constitutions also provided a rule book, how to run an organization. These were the regulations that were digested and set out by George Payne. And this was a structure that was emulated by virtually every other secular club and society, not just in Britain, but around the world. And again, I'm not sure this is widely understood, but the election of officers subject to democratic accountability with one member wielding one vote. Bear in mind that in the early 18th century, we didn't really have a democracy as such. The right to vote was limited in the extreme, not just to men only, but to men of property, and even then highly constrained. I was doing some research just the other day on a couple of rotten boroughs where the average electorate was 30 and all controlled. So the idea that within the lodge, each member of the lodge, no matter what his rank, each member had one vote. Majority rule, not a dictatorship, but majority rule. Orations, people would stand up and talk about what they believed in. They would make their views clear. There would be a discussion, and it would be a polite discussion. It would be a conversation. It wouldn't be people shouting at each other. The idea of a national framework for control and governance. Again, this was relatively new, and written constitutions and bylaws. Of course, we had this at a national level, but not necessarily, and not very often at the level of an individual society. Now, overall, I think it's fair to say that the Masonic ideology was based on the concept of meritocracy, of egalitarianism, and all of this was predicated on being aspirational, looking to improve oneself. And Margaret Jacob, who really is the doyen of historians in this particular space, started to research Freemasonry and the Enlightenment in the 1970s, 1980s. She wrote, particularly with respect to America, that this identity didn't prevent the lodges from being hierarchical, which obviously is still the case, and everywhere eager for aristocratic patronage, because aristocratic patronage sets the seal on Freemasonry. But it did ultimately tilt the lodges in the direction of being schools for government, inculcating principles for a more republican politics. There's a social atmosphere within which the new ideas of the age, religious toleration, scientific literacy, and intellect, rather than birth as a criterion of excellence, could flourish. And that is fundamental. It's particularly true in America, in North America, where you can see a direct line between the 1723 constitutions and the Declaration of Independence and the US constitutions that followed. And this is recognized in America. In fact, it's recognized in America to a far greater extent, unfortunately, than it's recognized in the UK. Now, these ideas that Freemasonry promoted were highly attractive. And within 2 decades, Freemasonry had become the largest and most influential of Britain's many clubs and society. And it's important to emphasize that it stayed that way right the way through into the 20th century, when, unfortunately, after the First World War, but more particularly after the Second World War, it rather lost its way. But being the largest and most influential of Britain's many clubs and societies had an impact not just nationally, but internationally, as Freemasonry was spread by migration, by trade, and by the military. And when you look at the way that it developed, of course, when you look at the military in particular, you see Irish Freemasonry and Scottish, but both of those had their roots in the Grand Lodge of England and in the 1723 constitutions. The Grand Lodge of Ireland's constitutions were developed almost verbatim based on the 1723 constitutions. Constitutions of ancient Freemasonry were based on Irish Freemasonry, which was based on the 1723 constitutions. And the constitutions of the US state Grand Lodges today are based on the ancient constitutions, based on the Irish constitutions, and again, come back to the 1723 constitutions. What is rather depressing is that most Freemasons have only the most limited knowledge of these aspects of the craft. And this is something that I hope the tercentenary will provide an opportunity to change, not just to understand that Freemasonry has this hinterland to be explored, but to really to take pride in what Freemasonry has achieved, and to understand that Freemasons and Freemasonry were both at the heart of change in the 18th century and in the 19th century, the heart of scientific change, philosophical change, and social change. Social change, particularly in the second half of the 18th century, when we had the development of ancient Freemasonry, and then in the 19th century after the Union in 1813, when Freemasonry became a much more accessible and much less elitist organization. And that, I think, has carried forward over the years. the idea that Freemasonry really does have a central role at the in society in terms of the identification and relief of distress. So the purpose of the tercentenary next year is to publicize Freemasonry's role in spreading Enlightenment principles, with the aim of helping our members understand what we stand for as an organization. Over the past 18 months to almost 2 years now, we've created and we put together multiple resources for use both centrally and provincially. All of this centers on an exhibition next year in the Museum of Freemasonry, but we hope, and this is what we'll be talking about this afternoon, Michelle, we hope that this is also going to be emulated more widely in the provinces. And to help that, we've put together a couple of additional electronic resources. One is a website, which contains a vast amount of information which can be used either to look at the tercentenary at a relatively sort of superficial summary level, or to drill down into pretty much as much detail as you want into individual areas, looking at the context, the impact of the Huguenots, the French Protestants having fleeing persecution in France. About 10% of London's population consisted of French Protestant emigres at the beginning of the 18th century, to look at the impact of James Stewart, the Pretender, and the 1715 Rising, and the threat of the threat to the Hanoverian succession, the threat to George I, the threat to George II of James Stewart coming back to England, supported by France or Spain or a combination of the two. These influences, if you will, within the wider society also impacted Freemasonry. So people can look at those, they can look at the individuals behind the constitutions, the Grand Masters at the time, the authors of the constitutions, and they can look at the impact that Freemasonry had elsewhere in the Americas, in Europe, and so on. So a lot of this information is also contained within UGLE's Brand Center, where pretty much everything can be downloaded. Michelle is, I hope this month or in October, putting together media packs, which will be available for use again in the provinces and more widely. Assistance with exhibitions and historical research, podcasts, most of which have been recorded, but we would love to add to that regional and provincial podcasts that take examples of what was happening locally and make that information available nationally. Lectures and talks that can be used to support local endeavors, either local exhibitions or local meetings, and merchandise, which is a bit of fun. Let me go back to merchandise, or forward to merchandise. So a nice range of merchandise which can be sold, well, which is being sold centrally, but which can also be sold locally to raise some money in the provinces. See if I can go back a bit. Can I go back a bit? Previous and previous and previous. So we've mentioned the exhibition in the museum. The South Gallery is being closed now, and the exhibition is being installed over the next couple of months. It will open in January. All of the items, almost all of them, are available in a digital form. So the exhibition will comprise individual cases of exhibits, obviously, plus a storyline, panels which will explain what is going on, why it's going on, and all of that information, both the exhibits and the panels, are available for download in a digital form. They can be printed and used locally. We have a special meeting of Grand Lodge on the 31st of January, followed by a lunch, and I am hoping that invitations to that will be going out in October, so that people will have an opportunity to book their tickets, basically. And that is being organized, I believe, on the same basis as the installation a few weeks ago was organized, with the provinces having allocations of tickets. But I'm hoping to get some more information on that over the next couple of weeks, if not sooner. We also have a conference, an academic conference at Queen's Cambridge, taking place in September next year. That is open to everyone, and if there are people with a particular interest in Masonic research, they're very, very welcome to attend. And the merchandise and memorabilia I've mentioned.